Nicholas Shaw. It's a subject about which I'm sure not many of us are very cognizant, but I imagine a lot of people were quite interested to learn about things that we're not very much aware of. Um, but from an archaeological standpoint, even though we're not likely to find in the very old archaeological sites here, it relates to the general archaeological problem of how do you study the changes of style over time. That's one general theoretical topic that this talk today is going to be related to. It's about the rise and fall of a style which became popular during a period when middle classes were forming or leisured classes were forming. And it shows how quickly these styles can change. They go in and out of fashion, and then, as we're going to hear about today, again, they come back into style again. So it's an oscillating pattern, and one can see this for many other kinds of artifacts. So this is going to be relevant to us in a general sense of looking at how ceramics form a very good mirror for what's going on in history and society. I'm going to turn now the podium over to Patricia Welch, who will introduce our speaker for today. Patricia.
Thank you, John. The story really begins when I was researching the history of our ceramic society back in 2018. I was in communication with Craig Barkley at the Oriental Museum at Durham University because we wanted to use some photographs from the Malcolm MacDonald collection held in the museum. And he in turn told me that there was someone who was writing his PhD thesis on Malcolm MacDonald. And that someone is today's speaker, Alexander Nicholas Shaw. Through that introduction, I wrote Alexander, who supplied me with some excellent leads on Malcolm's collection. And after we exchanged a number of emails, he informed me he was planning a trip to the region. So we seized that opportunity by the horns, as they say, and arranged for him to come out in February 2019 to coincide with our society's 50th anniversary. It worked out very well, and Alex gave a number of talks to various societies, including a talk hosted by the British ambassador while he was here, and a talk for, of course, our spectacular 50th anniversary dinner at the Tanglin Club that we held together with the China Society, because Malcolm had been one of their honorary members. It was only during that visit that I discovered that our speaker was also an historian of Singapore's intelligence services. And now that he's finished his PhD and is Dr. Alexander Shaw, he tells me he's working on a monograph exploring Singapore as a Cold War spy center, as well as a separate book looking at the intelligence culture of modern day Singapore. So our ceramic speaker this evening is also a military historian and is also editing a book entitled Fighting to Kill, which explores the small arms tactics of the British Army in the Second World War, with an anticipated publication date of 2021. As for now, Dr. Shaw is currently teaching high school students in Sunderland during the epidemic, which is the future shipbuilding center of the British Empire. But now he's going to introduce us to an area I doubt many of our listeners know much about. So over to you, Alex, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I shall now share my PowerPoint. Right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for joining me at whatever time of the day it is in Singapore and the US and as far away as Keighley, all foreign lands. But it's nice to see so many faces that I remember from my previous trips to the sunnier climes of Singapore city and the country, which, as you all know, is very close to my heart through my work as a historian of modern Singapore and its intelligence services. Now, today I'm not going to be talking about one of my academic specialisms, but my life as a ceramic collector. But obviously one of the reasons that I'm interested in the world of ceramics and Malcolm MacDonald's collections is that I am myself a collector of what we must admit is fairly low-grade English ceramic wares. So today we're going to be looking at the world of something called crested china, which was a really massive fad that, or craze that took off in Britain during the late 19th and early 20th century. And here on the screen, you can see an example of some of the pieces we're going to be talking about. And just as a more visual prop for an idea of size, here is a Belgian armoured car. So you can see that these things aren't very big. Now, Armorial, heraldic, or crested ware. Well, the terminology that we use to describe this type of porcelain, that as you can see, now this one actually is porcelain, but because it's made by a higher grade manufacturer, but a lot of these are stoneware, and even the porcelain is very low grade. These are white glaze, and they have, as you can see, a coat of arms on them. So obviously this relates to the longer tradition of armorial porcelain, particularly that which was commissioned to be made in China and shipped back over to the European great powers during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, as these armorial dinner services for various lords and ladies and other titled personages that you can see on the slides. Quite a fancy example of a piece from the V&A Museum. That if you visit Britain, you go around all the great houses, the Downton Abbey style country estates, you'll see a lot of armorial ware, porcelain made in China during this period for the export market. And really, what we're going to be talking about today taps into this rich tradition, but at the opposite end of the market, because Chinese armorial export wares were being produced very much for British high society. Today, we're going to be looking at porcelain that was made for the masses, or ceramics that were made for the masses, I should say, to acknowledge that quite a lot of it isn't porcelain because it's incredibly cheap and cheerful. Now, so that's why we call it crested ware, to distinguish, I think, from armorial or heraldic ware. And there's two reasons why we do this. The first is that the idea of heraldry and a coat of arms in the armorial sense more relates to the idea of a noble family. And the crest that you'll see on these pieces of ceramics represent towns and cities, sometimes individual buildings, rather than notable individuals. In fact, a lot of the crests didn't actually exist, but the idea of every town having its own coat of arms wasn't prevalent in England until this ceramic craze took off, that frankly, there were lots of places that were too small to warrant a coat of arms. And as we'll see shortly, one of the things that these ceramic manufacturers did when they wanted to create souvenirs was sometimes to invent a coat of arms, which is why I have several pieces in my collection bearing the arms of Sunderland, which is the city where I currently live. But they're actually different crests, because at the time, Sunderland did not have an agreed crest, even though it was one of the shipbuilding centres of the British Empire, and consequently two different designs were adopted by different companies. And in many cases, this led to these being adopted as the town's formal coat of arms, although the coat of arms of Sunderland today is actually very distinct from what you'll see on some of my pictures of some of my models. The other reason that we wouldn't call this armorial or heraldic ware is that the insignia that's emblazoned on isn't always an actual crest, it isn't always a coat of arms. Some of the First World War pieces, you might see the flags of the Allies, other military emblems, regimental insignia, and different slogans. So we use the term crested china because it's a much more encompassing term that acknowledges that all of these models have some form of crest or insignia on them, but this isn't always armorial. The reason we use the word china rather than ceramic is partly for the general reason that British people refer to all ceramics as china, that if you go into any sort of homeware shops in Britain today, if we were to go outside and go to somewhere like Wilko across the street, then you will see the kitchenware, the plates and things that people eat out of referred to as china rather than anything else. So being British, we refer to it as crested china. I know it's a bit of an inexact term. I never quite like it myself, particularly when talking to fellow collectors from Southeast Asia, but there you have it. And the example you can see here, the smiling Cheshire Cat, I hope everyone's familiar with Alice in Wonderland, is very much an example of what these companies were producing in the early years. And that reminds me that we should really talk about how this stuff came into existence. So as I'm sure you're aware, Britain invented the railways and really brought this transportation revolution to the world during the early Victorian period. But by the end of the Victorian period, the railways had transformed Britain. They were pretty much everywhere by that point. And this had major implications for industrial growth, for the transportation of goods across Britain and for export from its major ports like Liverpool and Glasgow and Bristol. But the railways also transformed leisure time in Britain. By the end of the 19th century, with the massive growth of the railway, fares were substantially reduced, and for the first time, lower middle class people could travel for holidays in Britain. They'd go for several days in the Lake District or to coastal towns, and even working class people could manage to afford a day ticket to visit perhaps the closest seaside resort. So workers somewhere like Manchester could potentially get the train to Blackpool for a day by the seaside. And this is very much becomes a status symbol. So British people who are travelling and holidaying for the first time, they want to show off to their friends that they've been to all these exotic locations like Blackpool, Grimsby, Filey, Bridlington. I appreciate for all our Singaporean friends, these places will mean nothing. So I shall perhaps describe them as being rather run down these days, seaside towns that in the heyday of the Victorian era, these were beautiful places that you wander around these seaside towns today, and unfortunately they've suffered from a lack of government funding, changing trends in travel, particularly from the 1970s when cheap air flights to Spain came in. You can see the grandiose Victorian and Edwardian architecture that reminds us that these spa towns, these seaside retreats, these were the places to be at the turn of the century in 1900. So people wanted souvenirs to show off to their friends that they'd visited these places. And this is where Crested China came in. It was very much a souvenir for the masses. So these were never intended to be high quality ceramics. They were very much mass produced. They were cheap. They were a product of the Industrial Revolution. And by displaying the crests of different towns, so here we have a crest of my least favourite town on the entire planet, a city called Coventry, which I would heartily recommend nobody ever visit. So here I can put this proudly on my mantelpiece and prove I've been to Coventry, next to a piece that proves I've visited Manchester, somewhere that shows I've visited Brighton. So this became, in the same way that the upper classes would display more expensive pieces of porcelain, either things that they'd acquired in China or Japan, or the likes of the Staffordshire pottery, some of their higher class figurines from the UK. So whilst the middle classes and the upper classes would display ceramics themselves as a status symbol, we also enter a period where the lower classes are doing this as well, at the much lower end of the market. And this picture is quite interesting in that it tells us something about how this was marketed and sold. In that pretty much you can find a Crested China souvenir from every town, even some villages in Britain, which is rather interesting because some of them, it's very surprising that these were holiday destinations around 1900. Now, a lot of the big manufacturers like WH Ghost, they only worked with one vendor. So there'd be an official vendor for the Ghost company in Brighton, for instance, and nobody else could sell their products. And here we can see a stand on Brighton West Pier in 1916. So this is a colorized postcard image that was originally a photo that's been hand colorized, which is why it looks a bit weird. And you can see the kiosk is displaying a sign that says Crest China. So this is a souvenir stand right on Brighton Pier, one of the real draws. This was one of the key holiday destinations of the period for British working and lower middle class people. And here you can see the stalls selling them these souvenirs. In the less zoomed in version, you can also see to the left there's some sort of put up stands which are exhibitions of the war that's going on. That really leads into the theme we're going to be talking about. Now, this all started because of William Henry Gosse, or Gosse as it's alternatively pronounced, who founded his company to produce a wide range of ceramic output. So the company didn't just produce these kind of cheap things, they also produced much nicer things as well. But his son, actually Adolphus, during the 1880s, realized that we have a new consumer market in these newly mobile, railway-enabled holiday makers. They can't afford to buy high-class porcelain, but they can afford to buy cheap, lower-grade porcelain, lower-grade bone china. The Goss Company doesn't produce these things in stoneware because they're one of the more quality companies. So they started producing these, what they referred to as souvenir wares, which were initially models of things that you would see in the local museums. So you can see on the slide, I have a postcard, which is an advertising postcard that's advertising the model of a Bronze Age pot that was found in Aberdeen. So the original models tend to be things like this. They are Roman or pre-Roman or often medieval artifacts that were found in the local area on display in a local museum. And one imagines that the original target market they were going for was museum goers. You could argue that these were perhaps the original museum shop souvenirs of the 1880s. Then the range started expanding. They started producing things based on local buildings and memorials, like Shakespeare's Cottage in Stratford-on-Avon, or the Captain Cook memorial statue in Whitby are all quite early pieces. That you can see here as well, the Goss Company, they produced their wares from a factory called the Falcon Works, so they adopted the falcon as their logo. By the end of the 1920s, there were approximately 150 different companies making crested china, which is pretty insane when you consider the size of England and the ceramics industry there in general. Now, a lot of those 150 companies weren't entirely separate, that the Arcadian company was led by a rather empire-building business magnate who actually ended up taking over Goss at one point, Carlton as well, one of the other big manufacturers. So after the First World War, so from 1920 onwards, a lot of these 150 companies are actually subsidiary of just one company, Arcadian, which is partly why these things die out in the 1930s, because due to the Great Depression, people aren't holidaying as much. The Arcadian company goes bust and brings most of the crested china industry down with it, which is why you don't see any of these things from the Second World War. It was very much a flash in the pan craze. So it starts in the 1880s with Adolphus Goss, and it continues until the very early 1930s. The heyday is very much the 1910s and 1920s, which one could think is surprising, because why people going on holiday in the middle of what was then the greatest war in history? Before I answer that question, one final point I want to tell you about the manufacturer is how they get to have these crests on them. So these are transfer printed in black and then were hand colorized. So the actual things themselves mass produced, mass fired, but rather a large amount of people employed to hand colorize the individual crests. And to be honest, even with the lower grade manufacturers, the crests tend to be finished in rather good quality. There's also often some gold gilding around the edges as well, just to make these look a little bit snazzier. So my collection is very much based around military themes, because I'm a military and intelligence historian. So these are what personally appeal to me. They're also what, in general, one of the most collectible these days. Now these have come back into fashion. And they started producing military models during the time of the Boer War, which was really very much a cause célèbre in Britain at the time. That it was technically the second Boer War, 1899 to 1901. We commonly refer to it as the Boer War these days, because frankly, it was just a lot more dramatic and exciting than the first Boer War. So during the second Boer War, Winston Churchill is a war correspondent. He gets captured by the Boers. He escapes from a prisoner of war camp and very dramatically makes it back to the British lines. And this is the event that makes Winston Churchill a national celebrity, secures his entry into politics, and arguably saves the world from Nazism. So the Boer War is very important, and it has very much left its mark on the British cultural landscape. I was born in the town of York, and the Boer War memorial there is actually bigger than the cenotaph for the First and Second World Wars. It's actually a lot nicer as well. It's a steepled church-like monument adorned with statues of soldiers, sailors, different ranks of service from the Boer War. Very lovely piece of architecture, which sadly the Crested China manufacturers didn't make a model of. They did, however, make models of two other Boer War memorials, Ashington and Hull, and I have both pieces in my collection with the matching crests. As you can perhaps surmise, the Ashington Boer War memorial has been destroyed, hence why I've got an old postcard image of it, whereas the Hull one still stands proud in Hull. Both models are quite interesting in that on the reverse of them, they have a verse transfer printed again on in black, which is the inscription that the original memorial reads. The Hull one says to the soldiers and seamen who fell in the defence of the British Empire during the South Africa War, so this is repeated on the back of the model, which I think makes them very nice and desirable pieces. I nearly bought recently a regimental ram from the Boer Wars. This was a model of a ram with the crest of one of the regiments involved, a nice commemorative description. Because obviously the British Army at the time liked having rams and goats as regimental mascots. I decided not to bid on it in the end because it had a hairline crack on it and the thing sold for over £200, which I thought was rather insane for a cracked piece of what was originally very cheap ceramic. Here we have a rather cruel caricature of Paul Kruger, the president of the Boer Republic, Britain's chief enemy during the Boer War. The piece you can see in the middle is a much more higher quality Weilmann teapot produced around 1900, so whilst the conflict was going on. I don't know if anyone's interested in teapots in particular. My grandmother has a rather substantial collection of British novelty ceramic teapots. These things, like Crested China, were popular souvenirs for the masses. Teapot collecting took off more in the 1960s and 70s, I believe. But here you can see a novelty teapot designed by Paul Kruger, and then you can see the Crested China version, even more simple. He looks a bit Humpty Dumpty-fied. Tim even actually has the Kruger teapot in his collection, it appears, which is just testament to the fact that we both like souvenir-ware British porcelain. Wow, that is pretty sizable. But I've never actually tried to get one, but I should add one to the collection to go with my Crested China one. Mine's only about that big, Tim. It's much less impressive. But yeah, the idea of doing a caricature of Britain's main enemies is something that comes back much more during the First and Second World War. It's interesting is that a lot of people think it's a caricature of Humpty Dumpty. It's not, it's Paul Kruger. If anyone tries to sell you one as a Humpty Dumpty, tell them they're wrong. Now, war breaks out in 1914, as I hope we're all aware, given its major impact on every corner of the world. And bizarrely, when this happens, the Crested China manufacturers, such as Goss, Arcadian and Carlton, are the big three names. My favourite company, like this armoured car, is actually Shelley. They're one of the higher class manufacturers, much more detailed, much better quality manufacturer. They see a business opportunity. They decide to become war profiteers. Because, of course, when the war breaks out in 1914, life kind of goes on as normal for British people. We send out the professional army to France and Belgium to fight the Germans. But it's not until 1916, the midpoint in the war, that conscription is introduced. Up until that point, Britain runs a volunteer army. It's also not until 1916 that rationing is introduced in Britain. So unlike the Second World War, where they were preparing for rationing and for air raids and gas precautions even before war formally broke out, the government was getting ready. They knew they'd have to implement these things at the very beginning. In the First World War, life kind of goes on as normal. People continue going to Brighton and Blackpool and Bridlington on holiday. But they're getting the war in the news every day, a bit like COVID is in the news all the time these days. So the Crested China manufacturer decide, let's sell them models of things relating to the war. But this is purely for profit. These aren't to raise money for the military. These are purely businesses profiteering from the current war. So the first models that are produced are things that they already had in stock, but with militarized slogans on them. So I've got a very small vase, which is the crest of Paris. deliberately chosen because the Battle of the Marne was very much fought with the goal of preserving Paris. So Paris is very much the focal point of the first few months of the war. And we can see on the back, transfer printed on, War Edition, AD 1914, a nice little commemorative piece produced during the first months of the war to remind people that we are actually at war, even though your life is going on as normal. As we'll see a few slides later, life doesn't continue to go on as normal. The Germans start bombarding coastal towns from their battleships like Scarborough, so the places where these would have been sold, primarily the coastal towns, come under direct attack. And then German Zeppelins start flying over Britain, dropping bombs. We normally associate German bombing with the Second World War, but it actually starts during the First World War. Firstly with Zeppelin airships and later with actual aircraft. And bizarrely, they even start making models of bombs with inscriptions on saying, model of the bomb that was dropped at this town in March 1915. And if you can get the model of the bomb dropped on a specific town with the crest of that town, it would be quite desirable. I've never managed to add one to the collection because these Zeppelin bombs always have a little handle at the top and they're invariably broken off. You can also see here an elephant, which is the crest of the Royal Field Artillery. So another popular thing is just to take random models. Animals were very popular around about the 1910 to 1915 mark. So they take the animal models and they just put a regimental or military crest on. I also quite like it because elephants were used to pull artillery guns in India, so it's and Burma, even during the Second World War. So it's quite a cool little nod to that. But then the Crested China companies start thinking, let's make deliberate models of things from the war, because this is what the British public wants. But you've got to remember the First World War is transformative in terms of the technology that is debuts in this war and really changes the face of warfare forever. And British public, they just can't get enough of that. They're fascinated by the way this war's been fought. If you imagine that your brother, your son, your husband, your father is off fighting this war, people want to know what life is like for them. How are they fighting? What weapons are they using? What do they do when they're not fighting? And the Crested China manufacturers, particularly the Arcadian company, spearpoints this. They decide, right, we'll give the public military-themed models. We'll invest in manufacturing and patenting new models. Arcadian has a very aggressive policy of patenting new models. They patent the model of a tank. Consequently, everybody makes tanks. They're one of the most popular models, and they have to pay a percentage to Arcadian for using the patent. Here we have two models that are both completely wrong. And I own one of them. I haven't bought the other one yet because it always sells for silly amounts. But here we have the model of a trench mortar, which probably shows up back to front on the screen, so you can take my word for that. It looks like a cannon, doesn't it, from a pirate ship or a Spanish galleon. So it also says for freedom on it to remind you why we are fighting the war against the Hun. Now, why does this model exist? Why is this a First World War model? And that tells us something about how these models were designed. In that the main way that the Crested China manufacturers, these ceramic producing businesses, the main way they knew about new technologies on the battlefield was from news reports on the wireless, the radio, or from the newspapers. So they presumably, this is another nice Shelley piece, presumably Shelley China's CEO read somewhere in a newspaper one morning that trench mortars were used to great effect in the action last night on the Western Front and thought, trench mortars, let's produce a model of one of those. What does a mortar look like? And obviously had it in his head of the mortar that was the antique type of cannon. So made a model of that, stamped on, telling people, this is a trench model. This is what Tommy is using on the front line. And people bought it not knowing that trench mortars look absolutely nothing like this. Trench mortars, in fact, look like the black and white photo you can see. And they look rather like the other model we can see, which has British trench mortar gun on it. The problem is, this photo shows British soldiers with a captured German trench mortar. And it's very probable that a photo like this inspired the model that you can see on the left, in that one of the Crested China companies saw a photo in a newspaper with British soldiers next to a captured German weapon and assumed it was their own weapon. So that's why this says British trench mortar gun on it. Later in the war, they corrected this and stopped stamping British trench mortar on it when they realised it was actually German. So the earlier manufacturer ones that say that it's British are actually quite desirable. It's not just weapons that people wanted to buy models of. They wanted to know how people lived their lives during the war. So here we have a model of a trench dugout, inspired by the sort of photo you can see here. This is actually a German trench that, generally speaking, the German trenches were much better maintained than the British, that they built stronger, sturdier dugouts. They lined the trenches with wooden plankings and plaited bamboo. They were much better protected against the elements and of course, British attacks. Here you can see a German soldier poking his head out and the very similar Crested China model of a British Tommy doing the same. The little slogan that you can see printed on, the victory of justice, armistice of the Great War, signed November the 11th, 1918, is quite a common slogan. I've got it on a couple of pieces, which is very nice because it means we can date this specific example to shortly after the armistice was signed, between November 1918 and June 1919, when they started using a peace treaty of Versailles slogan. The models also tell us something about humour at the time, but here we have 3 models that reference popular marching songs of the time. There is a map of England, quite interesting that it doesn't include Scotland. I think that if Scotland get their independence, perhaps this model will rocket up in value as a reminder that Britain and Wales can potentially manage on their own, even though I don't think they can. But there you have it. This is a verse of the song Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty on it. And Blighty was popular soldiers' slang for England. And the song references soldiers wanting to get sent back there. You'd often say, I had a blighty wound. That would be a wound that was severe enough for a soldier to be hospitalised and sent back from France to England, either to recuperate over a period of months or out of the war entirely. The centre model is the model of a soldier's kit bag, what they carried all their stuff in. There's a very popular song, pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. I can't sing for toffee, so I won't try and sing it, but there's a chance that some of you might recall that one. Another popular song, Keep the Home Fires Burning Till the Boys Come Home, is often referenced on models of kitchen ranges. They already made models of kitchen ranges before the war, so this was another example of an existing model that could be easily adapted to wartime purposes. The home front is perhaps unsurprisingly less popular in terms of models, but people throughout the ages have been drawn to warfare, to understanding the horrors of it, to finding excitement in the weapons used. And ultimately, the British public weren't directly involved in this. They didn't see tanks every day, so a tank was exotic and exciting. But a reminder of the privations of the home front wasn't that exciting. So this is quite a cheeky little model. It's a model of a coal scuttle, but I suppose this is something that you wouldn't really need in Singapore, given the weather. But obviously here in the UK, it's often very cold. So everyone had a coal fire, no matter one's status. And the coal scuttle was usually made of brass, sometimes iron, and you'd sit it next to your coal fire and you'd take it out to the coal bunker, fill it up with coal, bring it back in, put it next to your fire to top up your fire with every so often. And this little piece is a model of a coal scuttle, again, something they made before the war. It's got a cheeky little slogan on it reminding you that coal was rationed from 1916 to 18, because obviously we needed the coal more importantly for the battleships. So I quite like that little model, just as a reminder that by the midpoint in the war, the home front was hotting up. It was getting to be a little bit more like World War II, with hardships, privations, German bombing. Of course, the other way in which the home front is commemorated is through the work of women war workers. There's lots of very nice models of nurses, But my favourite model is that of a munitionette, mainly because I've never seen an example as nice as mine for sale. I think I got very fortunate with her in that she's got some painted shells, so she's just glazed in white like all of them, then painted over the top. There's no underglaze work going on here. She's got her nice crest, a little slogan, two slogans in fact, one telling us that she is doing her bit for the war effort, and perhaps her private thoughts, shells, shells and more shells. She certainly looks a bit fed up, but she's nevertheless carrying on, fighting on for Britain. Now, being a munitionette was a very dangerous job for women, but I used to live in a place called Leeds, which hopefully you've heard of because it's, after Singapore, the second nicest city in the world. Actually, no, KL probably ranks higher. But anyway, Leeds is a pretty nice city. And nearby Leeds, there was a major munitions factory in Crossgate, which had a major accident during the First World War. A lot of people died, but obviously these women were playing with live explosives, filling the shells. It was incredibly dangerous, and a lot of the materials used were quite toxic. They ended up getting the nickname the Canary Girls because the chemicals they were using were turning their skin yellow. So it was a very dangerous job that one must remember that it's not just the soldiers and sailors and the airmen who had the dangerous job in the war. Often a lot of the war industry work behind the scenes could be very detrimental to one's health, and you're also a prime target for German bombers. As you can see here, the ceramic model is a really lovely depiction of a munitionette, that she's got her cap on, obviously to prevent her hair from going into the going into the chemicals and so on, and she's filling the shells and to keep it out of the way, just as you would in a kitchen or soap factory nowadays, which reminds us that it was very much the fashion at the time for women to wear their hair long. This is before the age of the flapper girl in the 1920s, where women would have these rather stylish bob cuts. During the 1910s, women tended to wear their hair longer and therefore need these caps during the work in the factories. You can see that, her overalls smartly tied up, and she's holding a pile of shells. So probably my favourite model of them all, actually. Weapons are one of the most common types of models, and by this means the Crested China manufacturers educated the British public on what Tommy was using. Now we can see here on the left one of the most bizarre models going. It's a model of a Vickers machine gun, one of Britain's most successful weapons, in that it continues in service into the Second World War. And this was made in two parts. I wish I could hold one before you and demonstrate it, but the only examples that I've seen for sale are either damaged, as in the picture you can see here, it's slightly chipped at the front of the tripod, or horrendously expensive. It's a very desirable model. I used to work at the Royal Armouries Museum, which had a few on display, but I never convinced them to let me have one to deaccession it. Made in two parts, the tripod and the actual gun, so that it swivels around, which beggars the question, who was this aimed for? Is this a toy aimed for children because you can play with it and swivel? Or is it still aimed at an adult's market, people wanting to show off to their friends, in which case, why do the swivel? It's a very bizarre thing. It was only made by the Savoy company, which made much fewer models than, for instance, Carlton or Arcadian, but of a very high quality. So one day I will add that to my collection. The trench dagger is an Arcadian piece, and I put this on to really demonstrate that these are two ends of the market. But you've got the swivel in Savoy machine gun. You can see the belt of the ammunition on it, so much detail in the firing mechanism, whereas the Arcadian trench dagger hasn't even got the finger holes punched through. It's a very cheap model. Shells. I quite like artillery shells. To be honest, I used to research them quite a bit, and also small arms shells. And it's quite amazing the diversity of artillery shells that were made. But it's not just a case of one standard design, that the Crested China manufacturers went to great lengths to try and depict different types of shells. So the model you can see on the left with the crest of Flamborough, this is a Goss model of a British 6-inch incendiary shell. And to the left, I've put a photograph of an actual British 6-inch incendiary shell. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the ribbed ring at the bottom of the shell is replicated illustrated on the ceramic model, which is a very nice bit of detailing. They clearly saw, it's very likely they could have seen one of these in reality, because these were being made, mass-produced in Britain by the munitionettes. So it's quite possible that a representative of the company could have toured a factory to find out this information and copied the model from life, or at the very least from a picture they've seen in the paper. You can also see some nice shells with slogans on them. So a Jack Johnson, he was the heavyweight boxing champion of the time in America. So Jack Johnson is soldiers' slang for a German heavyweight artillery shell. It's a very high caliber German shell that would pound the earth and do a lot of damage. Soldiers would call these Jack Johnsons. So here the model is telling the British public something about the language that soldiers are using in the First World War, which I think is very interesting. Because ultimately soldiers would write back home to their loved ones using these slangs. They wouldn't always know what this meant, but they would know what a Jack Johnson was. Iron rations for Fritz is just a nice example of the sort of cheeky slogans that soldiers used to paint on shells before sending them to obliterate the Germans. I managed to find a picture there on Alamy of a shell with iron rations written on it, which perhaps this is the photo that inspired this model, who knows? Of course, artillery shells were fired from artillery guns, another very common model. Here we have a depiction of one of the most important artillery pieces of the war, the French 75mm field gun, still just about in service at the start of the Second World War, before France was unfortunately occupied by the Nazis. A very versatile field gun, and very important during the defence of Verdun. Here you can see a French diagram of it and some French soldiers using one. There's lots of different models of the French 75. The one I've got is one of the better ones, I would say. It doesn't have the shield in front of the gun, but it gets the overall shape quite well, particularly of the barrel, whereas some of the other models just look like a generic artillery piece that they're trying to fob us off as being a precise model of the French 75. This one, I think, is very much a deliberate model of the 75. And it's got that nice armistice description on it, which means this specific one was made between November 18 and June 1919. Tanks, one of the most common things that you can find on the market. They can be really cheap, like the one on the right, or they can sell for 10 times as much, like the one on the left. The one on the right is a Carlton model. They're actually both Carlton models, interestingly, which just shows how one company, the Carlton China company, was aiming at different ends of the market. But they're very much the cheap model on the right. I say it's cheap because the detail isn't quite there. The things at the back, these little wheels, they look a bit like training wheels, stabilizers on a bicycle, don't they? Early model tanks used to have these things to help give them support. Then they realized they didn't need it. They just made the tank a bit longer. Now, the one on the right is a male tank. The one on the left is a female tank, which might seem like an odd thing to say in the world of gender neutrality. But tanks at the time were gendered. Male tanks had a big gun on them. You can tell where the soldiers got this pun from, that they had a big artillery gun installed on each side of the tank. Female tanks had between 4 and 6 machine guns instead. So you can see the photograph of the tank. This is a female tank because it's got 2 machine guns on its side turret, and my model also has 2 machine guns on the side turret. Very nice model of a female tank. I'm very pleased that I spent the money and got that one. It's just a much crisper, detailed model than the one on the right. You can see the trailing wheels much more clearly. Interestingly, the first models of the tank only have 1 trailing wheel. It's meant to have 2, but Arcadian saw a photograph of a damaged British tank where one of the wheels had blown off and it only had 1 left. So they got a patent out, rushed into production within days of seeing this image, a model of a tank with 1 trailing wheel, until somebody at the War Office came along and told them, actually, they've got 2. You just saw a photo of a damaged one. And then they adapted the model to have 2. I've never seen one of the single ones come up for sale. I've only seen them in books. If I ever see one, I will get it no matter what, because it's a desirable model. Here we have some vehicles of war. One of the last few things I want to show you. Ambulances, incredibly common. Mine's quite a cheap model. Again, it's Carlton Company, which produced the most First World War models of varying quality, but it's a reasonable approximation of the British ambulance, I think made by the Crosley Motor Company that you can see in the picture. The armoured car, which I've shown you a few times, is a very nice model by Shelley of the Belgian Sava armoured car that was introduced very early on in the war. The only slight problem, you can see in the picture from the way the soldiers are peeking out, that the actual real armoured car, the turret was only at the front, it was open back to the turret. But when this model was produced, obviously the image that it was copied from only showed the front because it's a closed back turret, which is historically inaccurate. But it's a lovely model and a nice reminder of the fact that Belgium was one of the major fighting partners, as well as the reason that Britain entered the war. And I mainly include it as a shout out to my semi-Belgian friend Becky, who I hope is enjoying the talk. Aeroplanes, one of the most important things to come out of the First World War, the use of military aeroplanes. And Zeppelins as well, airships, both here memorialised in Crested China models. The aeroplane is quite interesting because it's a German model. So before the First World War, there was such a demand for Crested China. It was estimated that about 95% of English homes had at least one piece of Crested China in them. There was such demand that the British companies subcontracted out to German ceramic manufacturers to make their models for them, have them shipped back to England to be sold in England. So these weren't sold in Germany. I can't imagine they would have suited German taste. It was only the British and Australians that wanted to buy these things, really. Obviously, during the First World War, they weren't made in Germany, but after the war, as Germany was trying to get back on its feet again, the British Crested China companies sent orders out to Germany for fulfillment. So this piece we know was made after the war, but still reflecting a plane used during the war, because it was manufactured by the Germans. Ships and submarines are also quite popular. We've got a nice model of a minesweeper that my mother picked up for me at a car boot sale, which is like an open air market that we have in the UK that, depending on your point of view, are either an antique lover's paradise or a hellish field soaking wet where people are trying to sell a load of tap that you don't want. But occasionally you get some nice ceramics there. So we have a fishing trawler converted to a minesweeper. And one of my favourite and most recent pieces is a model of a British submarine with the crest of the Central Railway Station, Melbourne. Actually, Australia had its own Crested China manufacturers. It was never as big of a craze out there as it was in Britain, but it did exist. This isn't an Australian produced piece. It was made in Britain and exported to Australia for sale, because these were sold where the crest was. So Belgian armoured car with the crest of Coventry would have been sold and bought in Coventry, which means some poor devil had to go to Coventry to buy it. So this was made for sale at the railway station. I actually got a bit of a personal history from the person I bought it from, that their great-grandfather had been an Australian soldier on the Western Front, and that when he was returning home to his family, he bought this model of a submarine at the railway station in Melbourne to take home as a present, a memento of the war for his family. Perhaps this is the exact market this piece was aimed at. Perhaps that's why they were selling war souvenirs at main Australian railway stations. For, everyone's been there, haven't they? You go on a business trip and you're nearly home and realise, oh, drat, I haven't bought a present for the people back home. I'll go and get something from the duty free. Well, here we have an equivalent from 1919. After the war, they continue making all sorts of things. So a lot of the war models were continued in production afterwards because people were still interested in what happened. The next major event to be memorialised by Crested China is the British Empire exhibition of 1924. I've got a few nice pieces from this. The Herrick Lion is the emblem of the British Empire exhibition at the time. You can't really tell on the picture, but the image we have on the right of a radio operator is quite interesting because it's the only model I have in the collection that's not a white glaze. It's a mother of pearl coloured lustre glaze. These were uncommon, but used by a number of manufacturers on some models, particularly at the higher end of the market. And on an evening with all the light coming from my various lamps in my living room, it really dazzles on this piece very nicely. It's a very lovely piece to look at on an evening. And that's really all I wanted to say, other than perhaps the password on why on earth am I spending my hard-earned cash on these cheap and cheerful seaside souvenirs of the early 20th century. And I'm not the only person daft enough to do this. These have very much come back in fashion with collectors in Britain. And I think for myself, the main interest is very much in the social and military history of them, as you've probably realised after listening to me ramble on for the past 50 minutes, that I'm interested in what these tell us about the history of the war itself and how people in Britain perceive the war. But ultimately, these little models are one of the main ways in which the British public learned about how the war was being fought. These ceramics are a form of almost social mediation or social engineering in which British private businesses influenced people's perceptions of the war. They showed the war was a war of modernity. It was a war of alliance. Lots of the models, like the armoured car here, reference the fact that Britain was not fighting alone. So you could say that these are actually pro-Europeanist ceramics, that perhaps they have a slightly different political slant these days in light of Brexit. So that's one of the reasons I collect them. I'm a military historian, and I'm interested in the way in which the war was reflected on wider British society. But there's also an element of replicating the past, in that people bought these at the time to show the crests of places they visited. And if I have a choice between buying a particular model with a crest of somewhere where I've lived, somewhere where I've visited, or a crest of somewhere that I've never even heard of, I will always pay more to buy the more desirable crest. The reason I bought this lovely armoured car was it's the crest of Coventry on, which is a town that I love to hate, as any of my friends will tell you. But Coventry used to be an absolutely gorgeous town. Lady Godiva was from there, the famous medieval woman who rode through the streets naked. It's some beautiful medieval architecture until in the Second World War, the Germans destroyed it all. And unfortunately, it's a very brutalist place these days, where I spent a very unhappy research trip at the British Petroleum Company archives, finding out lots of interesting stuff, while staying in the worst hotel on the planet. Which I probably better not name in case they see it on YouTube and sue me for defamation. But the point I'm trying to say is that people still collect these things with similar motivations in mind. So to memorialise places they've visited, it's no longer my main motivation for collecting them, but it is on there. But ultimately, my main goal is to acquire a representative example of each type of thing. Everybody produced a tank. I can't have every British tank from every manufacturer, but I've got Mark I tanks. I could do with a Mark IV. I could do with a Whippet tank. There's a rather lovely model of a prototype Italian tank. Only 20 of the actual real tank were ever made, probably several hundred of, at least, if not over 1,000 of the ceramic models were made. So actually, the ceramic model of the Italian tank is more prolific than the real Italian tank. Bizarrely, but the guns are always broken off on them, which is why I've never been able to buy one. So ultimately, that's why I collect them. They tell me about British society at the time and its aesthetic taste. They tell me about the war and the way people understood the war, and I just think they look rather nice, actually. Yes, they're cheap and low grade, but with their pearl or white glazes, they sparkle lovely in the light. And you can see here, I have them displayed in one of my china cabinets, a ubiquitous piece of British furniture for the discerning collector. My cabinet on the left is from the 60s, on the right, probably from the 1930s. And yeah, they just look lovely there. I really enjoy them. And I'd like to thank you for listening to me rabbit on for probably longer than I should have done, and for sharing my love of crested china with all my friends here in Singapore and around the world. So thank you very much, everyone. I shall now stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaw. Yes, we all applaud silently. There are a lot of surprises in your talk, in particular the choice of subject matter. I had no idea that you had all that weaponry portrayed in ceramic form. So I very much enjoyed that. I now want to turn the show over to our secretary, Li Ching, who will then run the question and answer session. Li Ching, would you please take over?
Sure. Yeah, actually, I will start with one question. So when he said they are very cheap, so how cheap, how much did it cost at that time?
Goodness, I should have preempted this, shouldn't I? I do actually have an advertisement in the book. 2 or 3 shillings mostly, which whatever that is in modern money, I don't know. Somebody will have to look that one up. But yeah, these were definitely aimed at the mass market. They were like pocket money prices. Sort of, if you go into there's no good examples in Singapore because you've got such wonderful museum shops selling lovely things that I always spend far too much money in. But if you go into like a museum in Britain these days, there's always loads of things that you can get for under £5. These are the lower grade ones of these were very much the equivalent in that price range. They were selling in bulk. That you can see pictures of shops stocked full to brim of these. That's how they made the money. That the profit per piece was very low.
Mm-hmm. And the other, actually, you can just, if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself. Probably it will be, yes, Tim?
I've got a question. Alex, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you so much. I'm like you, a lover of English history, and anything that commemorates it in ceramics. Interesting. The Goss factory, I think, was in Staffordshire. So technically, you're a collector of Staffordshire. But what about all the rival factories? Were they also in Staffordshire, or were they sprinkled around England?
Yeah, mostly Staffordshire, mostly Stoke. But because most of the companies were actually just Arcadian operating behind a number of dodgy shell corporations, then they were just coming out of the Arcadian factory, but having a different stamp on them. You know, a bit like all the supermarkets like Tesco and Asda and that, they all make their own knockoff Kit Kats, but it's the same factory that makes them, but puts a different wrapper on. It's very much the same sort of process. That, yeah, they're all from the Staffordshire area, that, except the ones that are made in Australia, which I only recently found out that Australia had its own factory production of them. So I need to try and invest in some Australian pieces.
We can hear you.
Tim,
oh, can you not? Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
The coat of arms.
We've lost you again, Tim.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if I was covering up the mic or something. I'm just talking about the coat of arms. Singapore was given a royal coat of arms in 1948. I wonder if did Goss make any of Singapore?
So Goss tended not to go for non-British crest, but some of the other companies did. Very recently, I lost a bidding war on a piece. It didn't have the crest on, but it was from the Empire exhibition, and it had an image of the Malaya Pavilion, which covered both Malaya and Singapore. Obviously, Singapore was in the Straits Settlements at the time. I mainly lost this bidding war because I forgot to check on the auction of my bid, because I'd have happily paid what it went for, but I was just being rather foolish there. I wanted to use that as the advertising piece for this talk, but I rather foolishly let it slip. So yes, there are foreign pieces. I've seen some with the crest of Burma and Kenya on. There very well could be a Singapore or Straits Settlement piece out there, and if there ever is, I will get it at all costs if it ever comes on the market. Of course, it's worth remembering that whereas stuff was sold in Australia, when you see pieces like Burma or Kenya crest, these were for sale in Britain rather than to be shipped out to Burma or Kenya for sale. Because let's be honest, if you were in Burma, why on earth would you want cheap English ceramics when you're in Southeast Asia and have access to some of the finest ceramics in the world? So, which is interesting, because why were they producing things with colonial crests for sale? Probably for the Empire exhibition in 1924-5, that these would have been sold as exhibition souvenirs there. is, I think, the answer to that. But nobody's done any solid academic research into these things. That the only books on them are effectively price guides from the 1970s through to the 1990s. So one of these days, perhaps I will convince somebody like the Leverhulme Trust to give me a lot of money to do the first proper academic study of the crested china craze. That will be a dream, really.
Are the collectors mainly men, or do you know?
Yes, they are. But there are a couple of collecting clubs, and yeah, it's mainly men of more advanced years than myself. But I probably stand out from the crowd and been a young, charismatic chap collecting these things. I'm the James Bond of ceramic collecting, I'm sure.
The question earlier as to what a shilling in 1914 is worth today is the inflation rate since then is about 10,000%, so 100 times. So a shilling, which would be 5 pence in modern British money, would be £5 today. So if one of those things cost 2 shillings, that would be about £10 in today's money, which is about very roughly 18 to 20 Singapore dollars, which sounds about right, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very reasonable. But I have bought some pieces for actually that price, so they haven't gone up in value that much.
So they exactly kept pace with inflation.
You can get some pieces for £10 these days very easily of quite common things. You can also spend thousands on a piece. The rarest model of all, because it never went into production, it was only ever a prototype, and you'll figure out why when I tell you what it is. I've never seen one come on the market. It will probably go for 5 figures if it did, based on the 4-figure sums I've seen for less rare models. Mussolini. They actually produced a model of Mussolini to commemorate him coming to power in Italy. Only probably 3 or 4 prototypes were made before somebody sat there and said, actually, do we want to celebrate a fascist having seized power in Italy? And they realised, no, we probably don't. If one of them ever comes for sale, I'll have to hope I've made head teacher by that point, I think. But,
I'll do a deal with you, Alex. I'll be your scout in your south.
Tim, we can't hear you again.
Oh dear. I don't know why. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
It's when I touch the computer, it doesn't like it. Okay, I won't touch it. I was going to say I'll be your scout in the south of England, looking for examples that I know you'll like, and you can be my scout in the north, looking for commemorative teapots, because my collection can still expand a wee bit.
I'm very pleased that you've got the Kruger one.
Oh yeah, I'll show it properly. There we are.
Goodness.
Now,
It's the exact one. Very impressive, Mr. Clark.
Kruger was a very ugly man, and the teapot does I think capture his ugliness quite well.
Lovely.
Yeah, my Grafton crested china one has like some of his boils and stuff on it. So yeah, they really weren't trying to flatter him, were they?
He was warts and all. Well, of course, he was an enemy, so I guess they didn't want to make him look good. But I think that same mold, with some adjustments, was also used to commemorate Gladstone, who was a contemporary of Kruger. So they often did that. They'd use the same mold and just doctor it slightly and commemorate different people. In fact, the end of the Boer War was celebrated by a centerpiece in Staffordshire, which was also used to celebrate peace between England and Ireland. That same piece. It was just jiggered slightly and made to serve a different purpose.
Funny.
So what other Boer War output were the Staffordshire figurines producing?
Well, the Staffordshire by the Boer War was producing very inferior stuff. don't collect anything after 1880 because after that date it starts to get a bit poor in quality. But the Boer War generals were commemorated, General French and so on. But they are heavy, poorly decorated, poorly molded pieces, and I don't favour them. Although the centerpiece of the end of the Boer War, although it's late, is historically so interesting. I have owned the Irish version of that, although I did sell it. So because although it's historically interesting, it is aesthetically not very pleasing.
Mm. Is there a Staffordshire figure of Raffles to commemorate 1819?
Sadly not. Yes and no. There is a figure of Raffles's brother, because Raffles's brother was a very famous preacher. He was the sort of Billy Graham of Britain. He was a Methodist preacher, and his sermons attracted thousands. And so many figures were made of Raffles, his brother, but not of Raffles, our Raffles, no.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Yeah, otherwise we'd all want one.
Yeah, indeed. What a chance they missed. But Raffles, the governor of Singapore, was virtually unheard of in England, whereas Raffles, the preacher, was a figure, a celebrity.
Perhaps that's the next step for SAIAX to commission a porcelain manufacturer to produce retro-style souvenir figures of Raffles for all members, like a deluxe membership package where you get Raffles.
Thank you. We'll take that into consideration, Alex. If there are no more questions, I see our time is up and we should probably close. Thank you. This was really interesting. I learned a lot. So I think your audience joins me in saying thank you very, very much. And if anyone has more questions, if you send them to us, we'll drop them off and send them over to Alex. And we hope to see you in our part of the world again soon. So
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
I just want to put out an advertisement if I can for our
Oh,
next,
please, yes.
just to remind everybody, we have another talk coming up on the 9th of June. So exactly 1 month from today. It's going to be on ancient Southeast Asian pottery from the perspective of a practitioner. Not someone who makes ancient pottery, but someone who makes modern pottery. Has worked with potters in Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand. This is Alan Plakovetsky. He'll be talking to us from the wilds of Saskatchewan in Canada, which necessitates, again, us having our talk at another odd time, which is 8 p.m., which will be his 6 a.m. out on the prairies. So 8 p.m. on the 9th of June, Alan Plakovetsky. And so I hope we see you all there.
I'll put the notice and information up on the website the next few days, and the flyer will be mailed to all members by the end of the week. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
You.
Good
night.
day. Thank
Bye,
you.
Alex.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks. I'll be in touch to email. I'll be in touch.
Hopefully I can get down and meet you whilst you're theatre.
Yeah, come down and see me. Yeah, right.